Morning Algebra. Hope you all are doing well. So this video, you're probably going to wonder why we are jumping so far ahead in the book, but I'm going to explain. We are going to talk about the quadratic formula today. So if you want to kind of introduce yourself to it first, you could read pages 692 to 696. Now, the reason why we are jumping ahead so far, since we're only in chapter 6, is because I've taught you how to solve quadratic equations by factoring, but unfortunately, what happens if the quadratic equation can't factor? So then we have to still figure out how do you actually solve the quadratic equation, and no, there's no such thing as the answer of prime when you're solving a quadratic equation. So today I'm going to talk about the quadratic formula, which is what we use when a quadratic equation won't solve. And actually the quadratic formula can also be helpful when you're just factoring. Okay, so here we go. This will probably be kind of a long video. That's why you're just taking notes today. You're not submitting them and you don't have an assignment. All right, here we go. So this is the quadratic formula. X equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2 times a. And yes, you have to memorize that. And I know some of you are going, are you kidding me? That's huge. It's really not. It's kind of got a rhythm to it when you memorize it. Plus, you're going to use it so much that you'll get used to it. Now, if we were in the classroom, what I would have you do is I would have you practice memorizing it. And you would get it really quickly. Unfortunately, well, we're not there in the classroom to be able to do that. So maybe you can just kind of sit there and say it to yourself a few times. X equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2 times a. Now, it's not going to make any sense till you actually know what to do with it. So here we go. So the first thing you need to know, just like when we were solving quadratic equations, you have to have one side of the equation equal to 0. So here's an equation, and now this one actually we could solve it by factoring. I'll show you really quick. It would factor into x plus 2 times x plus 3 equals 0, and then you get x plus 2 equals 0, or x plus 3 equals 0, and then we get x is negative 2, or x is negative 3. Okay, so why would I be using this problem? Well, this way you're going to see that using the quadratic formula works on any quadratic equation, but to me the quadratic equation takes more time than actually factoring. But if something doesn't factor or you have trouble factoring it, then the quadratic equation is always here to actually help you solve it. Okay, so I'm going to write right here the answers I got, so that when we do the quadratic formula, we'd better get the same answers. So yeah, I erased everything on here because I want this whole page. Okay, so oops, I totally erased the problem. That was kind of silly. All right, so let me write the problem again. X squared plus 5x plus 6. All right, so how are we going to use the quadratic formula? Well, first of all, you got to know what a, b, and c are. So a, b, and c come from the coefficients. So I'm going to add an imaginary 1 right here. So my a is whatever is in front of the x squared, which is 1. My b is in front of the x, which is 5. And my c is my constant 6. So technically, this is what you're looking at here. Okay? But of course, you have to have your quadratic equation in descending order for this to be able to work. Okay, so a is 1, b is 5, and c is 6. Okay, so now what do we do with these numbers? So we're going to take the quadratic formula. X equals negative b. Well, b is 5, so negative b is negative 5, and yes, capital letters and small letters are the same thing, plus or minus the square root of b squared. So b is 5, so I'm just going to put squared in my square root, minus 4 times a is 1 and c is 6, all over 2 times a, which is 1. So all I did was I replaced my a, b, and c in the quadratic formula with all my numbers that I just found. So now I'm ready to do some computation. So x equals negative 5 plus or minus the square root of 5 squared is 25 minus 4 times 1 is 4 times 6 is 24. And by the way, you got to be very careful underneath that square root. You got to do order of operations. So you got to do all the multiplication before the subtraction over 2 times 1. Okay, so what do we have now? We have x equals negative 5 plus or minus the square root. This is 1. Well, what is the square root of 1? It's 1 over 2. Okay, so now you got to understand, what does this plus or minus equal or mean? So technically we have two problems there. We have x equals negative 5 plus 1 divided by 2, or we have x equals negative 5 minus 1 over 2. So we have to simplify both of those. So negative 5 plus 1 is negative 4. Negative 4 divided by 2, so x is negative 2. Look back up at the top here. Look, one of my answers was negative 2. Or x equals negative 5 minus 1 is negative 6. Negative 6 divided by 2 is negative 3. See how my answers match? So my answers are negative 2 or negative 3. So we got the answer to this quadratic equation by factoring or using the quadratic formula. But again, the question is, well, why would I use the quadratic formula when factoring was so much faster? Well, think back. I know all of you have struggled at times to factor whatever I give you. The quadratic formula helps you in a quadratic equation. Number one, if you're struggling to actually factor the part that needs factored, or what if it doesn't factor at all? That's why we have the quadratic equation, okay? Or the quadratic formula. Sorry, I said equation. All right, so I'm going to show you on this one why it's really important we have the quadratic formula. So here's the quadratic equation. It's already set to equal to 0. And I guarantee you could try to factor it, but it doesn't. There's no way you're ever going to get two numbers to multiply to be negative 2 and add up to positive 3. It doesn't work. So if this were in the last, sections before we actually started solving quadratic equations, you would have told me this was prime. But there's no such thing as a prime quadratic equation. So what we have to do, if it doesn't factor, we have to use the quadratic formula. So again, you're going to write the quadratic formula. X equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2 times a. Okay, so in my equation, I need to identify a, b, and c. So a is whatever's in front of x squared, which is 1. B is whatever is in front of x, which is 3. And c is whatever your constant is, which is negative 2. But again, you can't use the quadratic formula until you actually have one side of the equation equal to 0. All right, so we're ready to use the quadratic formula. So x equals negative b. So b is 3, so negative 3 plus or minus the square root of b squared. So b is 3, so 3 squared minus 4 times a is 1, c is negative 2, all over 2 times 1, which is a. All right, so we're ready to keep going. So x equals negative 3 plus or minus the square root of 3 squared is 9 minus 4 times 1 is 4 times negative 2 is negative 8. So I have 9 minus negative 8 on the inside of the square root all over 2. All right, so now I have x equals negative 3 plus or minus the square root of 17 all over 2. Okay, now I will tell you right now, I'm going to share this with you. Sometimes in the future, your teachers are going to say, when you use a quadratic formula like this one, square root of 17 isn't a perfect square root. So we're going to get some decimal answers here. Now, sometimes your teachers are going to tell you, just leave it in radical form. This is radical form. Radical means a square root. So if your teacher says leave your answer in radical form, what they're saying is just leave this answer as negative 3 plus or minus square root of 17 over 2. Me, I'm going to tell you I want it to go to decimal form. So what that means is I'm going to find my two actual answers. So x equals -3 plus or minus the square root of 17. I didn't mean to put plus or minus there. I'm sorry. I meant to just put one of them. Try again. So -3 plus square root of 17 over 2, or x equals -3 minus square root of 17 over 2. Now at this point, I have to tell you, what do I want you to round your answer to? So let's just say today round to the 10th. Okay, so I'm going to write round to the 10th. Now this is definitely where you're going to want a calculator. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my calculator because I have to do the square root first. So I'm going to take 17 and I'm going to take the square root of it, and on my calculator it's a big long number. 4.1231056.256, and it keeps going. Well, I don't want to use all those numbers, but I also do not want to round to the 10th, because if I round my square root of 17 to the 10th now, and then I round my final answer, I've now rounded twice. So I'm just going to use, on my calculator, I'm going to use 4.1231. Okay, so that way I didn't actually round it, I used a few digits. So now my problem says -3 plus 4.1231 divided by 2. So I got to do that math, and I sure can't do it in my head. So I'm going to take my calculator and do -3 plus 4.1231, and then divide my answer by 2. My calculator says 0.56155. Now I'm going to round. So my first answer is 0.6, or now I got to do the same thing on the other one, but I don't have to do the square root of 17 because I already know it's 4.1231. But the difference is now I'm going to plug in my calculator. I'm going to plug -3, and instead of plus, I'm going to do minus 4.1231, and I'm going to divide by 2. And my second root of this problem, or my second solution to the nearest 10th, is -3.6. So my two solutions to this quadratic equation are 0.6 or -3.6. Okay, now why have we never talked about decimals or anything before? Well, because everything that we did factored nice and neatly. When they don't factor neatly, this is where we get these strange, they're called roots or solutions. Okay, so the answer to this problem is 0.6 or -3.6. All right, here's the next problem. And again, something weird is going to happen in this problem. So I'm trying to do a little bit of everything today. So 2n squared plus 3n equals -3. So first of all, I can't do anything until I get one side equal to 0. So I'm going to make this 2n squared plus 3n plus 3 equals 0. And again, I could try to factor it, but I guarantee you it doesn't factor. And if I don't even want to try to factor, now that I know the quadratic formula, I can go straight to using the quadratic formula. All right, so to get yourself in practice of knowing the quadratic formula, write it down first. X equals -b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2 times a. Okay, so in my problem, my a is 2, my b is 3, and my c is 3. All right, so start plugging them into the actual quadratic formula. So x equals -b, so -3 plus or minus square root of b squared, b is 3, minus 4 times a is 2 times c is 3 all over 2 times 2. Okay, so let's start looking at this. X equals -3 plus or minus the square root of 9 minus 4 times 2 is 8 times 3 is 24 all over 4. Okay, so now I'm going to introduce you to something that's a little weird, and that is, I haven't talked about this yet because it wasn't necessary yet. I'm going to go back to right here. So see where I'm circling in red? The part of the formula that I just circled has a special name. Just the square root of b squared minus 4ac. That has a name. its special name, it's actually called the discriminant. The discriminant is very important, okay? The discriminant actually helps us determine if this actually has solutions, okay? So the discriminant, if when I do the discriminant, okay, if I get a positive discriminant, then I know that this problem has at least one solution. Sorry, I'm abbreviating. Now, if my discriminant comes out to be negative, all right, now look at the problem we're doing right now. 9 minus 24 is going to be negative 15, so we have the square root of negative 15. Well, guys, you can't take the square root of a negative number. So if my discriminant is negative, that means the problem has no solutions. Can't factor it, can't use the quadratic formula. So that means there's no solutions, okay? Now, if the discriminant comes out to be an exact 0, that means the problem only has one solution. Now, I'm going to write all of that on the next page just so that you understand. So let's finish this problem, then we'll talk a little bit more about the discriminant. So this problem ends up turning into x equals negative 3 plus or minus the square root of negative 15 divided by 4. Well, because I have a negative discriminant, what that means is I can stop this problem right now. This problem, no matter what I do, has no solutions. Okay? So I'm going to write this discriminant thing out again. So this part of the problem, b squared minus 4ac, again is called the discriminant. Okay? And the discriminant, that's an I, is very important. So if I do b squared minus 4ac and it comes out to be a positive answer, then I know my quadratic equation is going to have two solutions. And you know what I'm going to write? At least. Because it could have had more if there was a GCF, but we'll talk about that later. Okay, if the discriminant comes out to be a negative, like it did in the last problem, that means we have a square root of a negative number, which we can't find the square root of a negative number. Now, some of you that have kind of read ahead in your life in math, you will find out there are ways you can do the square root of a negative number. It gets into complex numbers. We're not going to worry about that, okay? So if you get a negative discriminant, what that means is there's no solutions, okay? Now, if the discriminant comes out to be an exact 0, so you get the square root of 0, what that means is the problem is going to have one solution. Okay? Now, the discriminant can help you in many ways, and it actually becomes very handy when you get into some story problems later, but unfortunately we're not going to get to those this year. But I wanted to talk about the discriminant because I felt like it was pretty important that you guys think about that. So what I'm going to have you do now is I'm just going to have you do some practice of the quadratic formula. Now, I'm going to tell you now, I'm going to force you to use the quadratic formula. Even if a problem factors, I want you to go ahead and use quadratic formula because I just want you to get a handle on it at this point, okay? So problem number 1 that I want you to do is 4x squared plus 3x minus 1 equals 0. So I would like you right now to stop the video, find your answers to this problem using the quadratic formula. Okay, I'm going to go over this. So first thing, it's already equal to 0. My A is 4, my B is 3, and my C is negative 1. Okay, so again, I always get in the habit of writing on the formula x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2 times a, because once you write it enough, you'll memorize it. Okay, so let's see here. X equals negative 3 plus or minus the square root of b is 3 squared minus 4, a is 4, c is negative 1. all over 2 times 4. Okay, at this point I'm ready to start simplifying and computing. So x equals -3 plus or minus. I have 9 minus 4 times 4 is 16 times -1 is -16 all over 2 times 4 is 8. So this gives me x equals -3 plus or minus the square root of 25 over 8. All right, so now my two solutions are x equals -3 plus square root of 25 is 5 over 8, or x equals -3 minus 5 over 8. So if I look at x equals -3 plus 8 divided by, -3 plus 5 divided by 8, that gives me 2 eighths, which x is 1/4. Now you could also have the decimal, but now here's what people are going to think, because I just talked about, well, we'll round to the 10th today. Well, if it's a decimal that comes out to be a terminating decimal, we don't round that. We all should know 1/4 and 0.25 are the same thing. If I rounded 0.25 to 0.3, is that the same as 1/4? No. So we're only going to round to the 10th if it's not a terminating decimal. In fact, in this problem, I'd rather you leave it 1/4 anyway. Or x equals -3 minus 5 is -8 divided by 8. X is -1. Okay, so just so you know, would this problem have factored? Yes, it would have. So I'll just show you really quickly. It would have factored into 4x and x, and it would have factored into +1 and -1. So it would have been 4x minus 1 equals 0, or x plus 1 equals 0. So 4x equals 1, so x is 1/4, or x is -1. So I just want to show you the connection between, you could have solved it by factoring, you could have solved it by quadratic formula, but I forced you to do quadratic formula. So at this point, you really have your choice. All right, here's problem number 2. So again, I want you to go ahead and try it by yourself. Hint, hint, make sure you get one side equal to 0. And this one, I'm sure there are going to be some of you that are like, well, if I get the left side equal to 0, I only have to move one term. I would highly suggest when you get one side equal to 0, try to keep your coefficient in front positive. Okay, so go ahead and try this problem and see what you come up with. All right, so the first thing I would do is I would make this 3x squared minus 5x minus 4 equals 0. Then I'm going to do my a, b, and c. A is 3. B is -5, C is -4. I'm going to write my formula. X equals -b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2 times a. All right, so now I've got x equals, now -b, but b is negative. That means this is going to become a +5 plus or minus. B squared is -5 squared minus 4 times a is 3, c is -4, all over 2 times 3. Okay, so now we've got x equals 5 plus or minus the square root of -5 squared is 25 minus 4 times 3 is 12 times -4 is -48 all over 6. So now I've got x equals 5 plus or minus the square root of 25 minus -48, 73, divided by 6. So now I know that I'm going to need my calculator because square root of 73 is not a nice number. So this one is going to be one where I'm going to have to round to the nearest tenth, but not until the end of the problem. So when I take the square root of 73, I get this long number, 8.544003744, so on and so on. So I'm going to say the square root of 73, I'm going to use, 8, maybe. Why can't I get my pen? 8.544. Okay, that's good enough. All right, so now I know my answer is x equals 5 plus 8.544 divided by 6, or x equals 5 minus 8.544 divided by 6. Okay, so let's see here. When I do the math, 5 plus 8.544 divided by 6 gives me, to the nearest tenth, I get 2.3, or if I take 5 minus 8.544 and I divide by 6, that gives me negative 0.6. So my answers are 2.3 or negative 0.6. All right, number 3. Go ahead and try this one by yourself. All right, so the first thing I need to do is I need to get one side equal to 0. So 7x squared minus x plus 8 equals 0. All right, so I'm going to identify my a, b, and c. So a is 7, b is negative 1, and c is 8. Okay, so when I write my formula, x equals negative b plus or minus square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2 times a. So now I've got x equals negative b. b is negative 1, so negative b is 1, plus or minus the square root of. I have b squared, so that's negative 1 squared, minus 4 times a is 7, c is 8, all over 2 times 7. Okay, so now I've got x equals 1 plus or minus square root of negative 1 squared is 1, minus 4 times 7 is 28, and then 28 times 8 is 22. So I have 1 minus 224 all over 14. So right now, my head is going, whoa, wait a minute. If you look at your discriminant, you're going to end up with this. X equals 1 plus or minus the square root of negative 223 over 14. At that point, you should be saying to yourself, this problem's done. I have a negative square root. Therefore, my answer to this problem is no solutions. Okay, so we did a lot today with quadratic formula. I would really like you all by next Wednesday to memorize this formula. Okay, so next Wednesday, you'll have an assignment over quadratic formula. And then we'll have one more day of class, and I'm going to teach you how to graph parabolas. I'm going to do a mandatory Zoom meeting that day. You're not going to have any assignment over it or anything. It's just I want to introduce it to you. So I know I've introduced a lot to you really quickly, but I want to at least introduce it to you before Algebra 2 next year. And they're going to know what we've covered. You'll be okay. So anyway, have a good weekend. I will see you next week.